In light of this summer, it's had me thinking a lot about criminal justice. This is the summer of 2020, of course, and while there has been COVID, there's also been protests regarding the death of George Floyd as well as police brutality. And I started thinking about criminal justice policy, which is things that I think about, and I don't necessarily expect you to. But as I was thinking about it, some things kept coming up from my ninth grade year of high school, which was the song by System of a Down called The Prison Song, which I'm going to provide an analysis of right now. First of all, before we even jump into the song, I want to give you sort of an introduction to what was going on at the time. There was a genre of music that came out in the late 90s and got really popular in the early 2000s, and it was called nu metal, N-U metal. It included bands such as Korn, Limp Bizkit, Slipknot, and Linkin Park, which I don't actually see Linkin Park on here. And Kid Rock, for some reason, is in this picture. I never thought of him as in that. But anyway, included bands like that. And basically, it focused on this kind of rap rock aesthetic. So you had these like thick, heavy metal kind of riffs that really grooved and made you bob your head. And then somebody would be rapping over the top of that. And this was really new and trendy. The only band that had really explored that before was Run DMC and Rage Against the Machine, which was before this time, Rage Against the Machine was. But many critics didn't like it. They viewed it as very vulgar and very unrefined. It was kind of viewed as like the professional wrestling of rock. It was very like blue collar and was not appreciated by critics. But one of these bands really rose up above that low culture and really dealt with some complex, high-level intellectual issues, and that band was System of a Down. Out of all the bands in the era, System of a Down has really held up the best. Their breakout hit album was Toxicity. You can kind of see the numbers here. Sold 12 million copies worldwide. It went 12 platinum. And it came out September 4th, 2001, which was just, it was 19 years ago. But it was also just a few days before 9/11 happened. And this was an album that was very political. And it had a lot of maybe some anti-American sentiment to it. And it was not a popular time to have that point of view right after 9/11. Toxicity is probably the most famous song is Chop Suey, which you may have heard. It's about like, I'm not going to sing it right now, but most of their songs deal with things like the environment. They deal with war, science, spirituality, philosophy, but a lot of the songs really deal with politics. And so this interest in politics was rooted in the fact that all of the members of System of a Down grew up in this Los Angeles Armenian American community, and each had members of the family who survived the Armenian genocide of 1915 to 1923. Now, it's important to say about that Armenian genocide is that many people, millions of people died in the Armenian genocide, but most of the world powers would not acknowledge that anything happened. So this created a culture for Armenian Americans that's described on the website Headstuffs. It says, the ongoing denial of the genocide by the Turkish government highlighted to System of a Down how injustice can persist without the political will to stop it. So this idea of conveying truth in their music, political truth, really motivated the political themes in their songs. So while there's a lot to analyze on this record, I'm going to focus just on the Prison Song because it deals with the justice system. And it's interesting that a lot of the ideas that are brought up in this song that came out in 2001 are very, very, very relevant today. Specifically, mandatory minimum sentences. So at this point, I would like you to listen to the song. I can play it here, but it doesn't really come through very well. Let's see. Okay, so you should listen to the whole song before you continue with this presentation. Oh my gosh! I don't know how well it comes through. Let me put my glasses back on. So the song is really characterized by this blast of drums with this little whisper that's there trying to build a prison. Okay. Now, the first question, this lyric comes up quite a bit in the song. The first thing you need to break down is this sentence. First of all, they're trying to build a prison. What kind of prison? Like a physical prison? A mental prison? What kind of prison are we talking about? The other thing is the they are there. They're trying to build a prison. Who is trying to build a prison? Now, most likely, the U.S. government is who they're referring to because of the political nature of this band. And I think it's important to break that down. So the United States is trying to build a prison. Okay, they build many prisons. There's federal, state prisons, local jails, and such. But what I realize is that this really comes down to a few different things. First of all, Kanye West. This will make sense in a second. You might be familiar with 2020 presidential candidate Kanye West's Twitter rant where he said we need to abolish the 13th Amendment. This seems like a terrible idea because the 13th Amendment abolished slavery, right? So maybe the they is Kanye and he's trying to build a prison, but no. To Kanye's credit, what he was talking about is abolishing the 13th Amendment because, wow, it says neither slavery nor involuntary servitude will be allowed, except, and this is in the amendment, except as a punishment for a crime whereof the party has been duly convicted. Okay, that was the part that Kanye wanted to abolish, was that there still is slavery happening to this day. It's just in our prison systems. See, now the plot is thickening. So I ended up watching, for research on this documentary this summer called The 13th, and I think this came out about 2 years ago. It's on Netflix right now. It's actually on YouTube for free, so you can watch it. This looks at the prison system in that context of African American incarceration and the 13th Amendment. The 13th Amendment outlawed slavery after the Civil War, but this movie makes some interesting claims that the U.S. is trying to actually build a prison, specifically for African American minorities. First of all, let's look at a couple claims that are made in this movie, which honestly, this movie could be analyzed as a media analysis assignment all in itself, but I'm going to use this to explain as one of my sources to explain what's going on in this System of a Down song. First of all, the United States is home to 5% of the world's population, but it has 25% of the world's prison population. Yes, in the land of the free, 25% of the world's prison population. That raises some red flags for me. Another claim in this movie is that African Americans make up only 6.5% of the American population, but 40% of the prison population, which shows you something's going on there that is disproportionately affecting African Americans. And what that is honestly a policy analysis all in itself, but it's important to raise that. And then looking at different races here, if you look at, while a white male has a 1 in 17 chance of ending up behind bars, for black males, it's 1 in 3. Latino men, it's 1 in 6. And all men, it's 1 in 9. Women, 1 in 56. So that's interesting. Now, System of a Down provides a synopsis of why this is happening. Okay, and they do it with just a couple lyrics that take a while to unpack. The lyrics are, following the rights movements you clamped on with your iron fists, drugs became conveniently available for all the kids. I buy my crack, I smack my beep right here in Hollywood. Nearly 2 million Americans are incarcerated in the prison system of the U.S. First of all, this part, I think, is making a parody of culture at that time, which was celebrating drug usage. And it's saying, like, look at, I buy my crack and such like that. And it's like celebrating drug culture, which you shouldn't do drugs. That's just a good policy to follow. And while I could break that down, I mean, that's about as far analysis as that lyric goes. But there's a couple things to break down here. Following the rights movements. The rights movements are talking about the rights movements of the 1960s, the hippie movement, the African-American civil rights movements. There's this African-American tone in here. Drugs became conveniently available for all the kids. So after the 1960s, drugs became conveniently available. I wonder why that is. And, of course, some of these lyrics really beg some conspiracy theories. And then it makes fun of these drugs being available, like somebody's like, look I do drugs. But they're actually playing into this scheme of whoever's conveniently providing these drugs. And then it says, and this is the big one here, nearly 2 million Americans are incarcerated in the prison system of the U.S. At the time of this song, the number was almost 2 million, and at this point, it's 2.3 million today. Now, what the heck happened here at the end of the Civil Rights Movement in 1970, where you had 196,000 Americans in prison? How did it jump to 2.3 million today? And you can see it's really kind of flatlined in the last 20 years at around 2 million, okay? And I will possibly explain that a little bit at the end. Now, what's interesting about this is that of all these people in prison, 45% of them are actually in prison for drug offenses. And this is going to tie into the song. So U.S. legal definition says a drug offense refers to the possession, use, sale, or furnishing of any drug or intoxicating substance or drug paraphernalia that is prohibited by law, that's not allowed. So you might say, well, yeah, 45%, I mean, they're criminals, they should be locked up, and you can make an argument for that. But I want to just throw a few more statistics at you. The Bureau of Justice Statistics states that 99% of drug offenders in federal prison were serving a sentence for drug trafficking. Okay, so most of these are for selling drugs or trafficking drugs. Cocaine, powder, or crack was the primary drug type for half of those arrests. So 54% of drug offenders are for cocaine or crack. The race of drug offenders is varied greatly by drug type. So by race, blacks are 88% of crack cocaine offenders, Hispanics are 54% of powder cocaine offenders, and whites were 48% of methamphetamine offenders. More than a third, 35% of drug offenders in federal prison at sentencing had either no or minimal criminal history. So that means 35% of the people that end up in prison had minimal or no prior offenses, and they ended up in prison for a drug offense, possibly a minor drug offense. Okay, so I'm going to break this down a little bit more of this history, but I just want you to know that most of the people in prison are in there for drug offenses. So if we go back to the history of this, and I know you might be thinking like, well, hey, you know, they broke the law, they should end up in jail. But looking at the history of this is pretty interesting. And honestly, if you want to pursue this further in your project and push back on some things I say, please do. I want to encourage discourse. Don't take everything I say as gospel. I'm a human being. I'm providing you information the best of my ability, but you should always be skeptical of information, even from the person who's telling you to be skeptical of information. Think about that. So a lot of what this song has to do with, and I found this out, was the war on drugs. And this is a very complicated issue that could require its own analysis. But on June of 1971, Richard Nixon, this gentleman here, former president, declared the war on drugs, stating that drug abuse was public enemy number one. Now, while a rise in recreational use in the 1960s may have led to the war on drugs, remember that was the hippie movement, a 1994 interview with President Nixon's domestic policy chief, a member of his cabinet, John Ehrlichman, said that the war on drugs had ulterior motives. So he says this in 1994. The goal was to silence those who opposed President Nixon, namely the anti-war left and black people, according to his own quote. Ehrlichman was quoted as saying, "We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or against black people, but getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both marijuana and heroin heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did." That's what this gentleman said. Now, it is important to note that that's the only evidence that we have of Nixon actually using the war on drugs to silence the anti-war left and African Americans. But stay with me. The plot does thicken, and you can tell there was an awareness of this early on from this photo. So while the 70s saw less of an emphasis on the war on drugs, the Carter campaign, actually, the only Democrat that was elected from 1968 to 1992, I believe, he actually wanted to decriminalize marijuana, make marijuana effectively legal. But in the 1980s, the Reagan administration reinforced Nixon's war on drugs. Remember, Reagan and Nixon are both part of the same party, the Republican Party at this time. This is where we get stuff culturally that's kind of fun to explore. The DARE program came out of this. I remember growing up and doing the DARE program. They said DARE to keep kids off drugs. They also had the Just Say No campaign, where you would this was led by Nancy Reagan, the first lady at the time, to just say no to drugs. There's also some terrific public service announcements that come out during this time. For example, Pee Wee Herman telling you not to use crack. Let's look at this.
This is crack, rock cocaine. It isn't glamorous or cool or kid stuff. It's the most addictive kind of cocaine, and it can kill you.
Okay, so
it's really bad.
You're welcome to look that up. Pee Wee Herman telling you that crack cocaine is bad. It is bad, by the way. I just think it's funny that Pee Wee Herman is saying it. And then this cartoon, Cartoon All-Stars to the Rescue. Every single cartoon character that was popular in the early 90s, late 80s, was on this cartoon. And I remember renting this as like a 5-year-old kid from Video Showtime, it was called. And I'd rent it. I rented this movie over and over again. I should have just bought the thing because it had all my favorite cartoon characters in it. But what's crazy is I didn't know really what crack was. I was 5 years old. I didn't really even know what drugs were. And I watched this cartoon, so I'm going to show you a little clip from this. I'm going to go to the Ninja Turtle one because I like the Ninja Turtles. So here we go. So this kid is being tormented by these like bad kids and this, I think it's like a crack cocaine ghost of some kind. And the cartoon characters help him realize the error of his ways.
Cowabunga, dude! How did you ever get so totally cool?
What am I doing down here?
Like you fell through a radical hole, dude.
Radical hole, dude.
You could have avoided it, but you weren't thinking. Come to think of it, that's a lot of your problem.
What problem?
Drugs, bud. Your brain must be, like, really messed up.
Drugs don't do anything to your brain. They just make you feel good, right, Mikey?
Right.
Whoa, dude. If you're taking his word for it, you're really in trouble. Better see for yourself.
Well, what are you talking about?
This.
Where am I?
Well, you're about to take a trip through the human brain, thanks to the power of imagination.
Anyway, that's a real thing that existed in history. I mean, if there's anybody I trust to tell me not to use drugs, it's Michelangelo, the party dude of the Ninja Turtles. But anyway, so those are some interesting things that came out during the 80s. Lost my place here. Here we go. But then there's also laws. So this is Nancy Reagan here, and this is President Ronald Reagan. And one of these laws that came out was the 1986 Anti-Drug Abuse Act, which established mandatory minimum sentences. That will come up in the lyrics of the song in just a second. This law was heavily criticized as having racist ramifications because it allocated longer prison sentences for offenses involving the same amount of crack cocaine, which was a drug that's predominantly used by black Americans, as it did for powder cocaine, which was often used by wealthier white Americans. So 5 grams of crack triggered an automatic 5-year sentence, while it took 500 grams of powder cocaine to merit the same sentence. Overall, the policies of this act led to a rapid rise in incarcerations for nonviolent drug offenses, from 50,000 people in 1980 to 400,000 in 1997, and then to in 2014, nearly half of the 186,000 people in federal prisons in the U.S. Were incarcerated. All this data comes from the Federal Bureau of Prisons. And also, these are used on history.com as well, which will be in my citation. So this is just federal prison that we're talking about. You got to imagine the justice system is not one unified thing. There's the federal justice system, and every state has a justice system. And then every city has a justice system. So when you're rallying against the justice system, you got to pick the right one, or you just kind of lump them all together, which I think can be problematic because they're all so different. But I don't know, I could be wrong. But it seems like I've been bashing on Republicans, but Republicans aren't the only ones who made legislation like this. Democrats through the 80s were viewed as soft on crime, and this meant that they were losing a lot of elections. Remember, Jimmy Carter was the only Democrat actually elected. So this led to the election of George H.W. Bush after Ronald Reagan. Now, the Democrats, after losing that election, basically because they were soft on crime and George H.W. Bush was hard on crime, they changed their image. And this all culminated with the biggest crime bill in U.S. history, the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act of 1994. Now, while the long-term impact of this bill is debated, the Justice Policy Institute said in 2008 that the Clinton administration's tough-on-crime policies resulted in the largest increases in federal and state inmate populations of any president in American history. The law imposed tougher prison sentences at the federal level and encouraged states to do the same. It provided funds for states to build more prisons, aimed to fund 100,000 more cops, and backed grant programs that encouraged police officers to carry out more drug-related arrests. You can see where this is going. An escalation of the war on drugs. Perhaps the most infamous part of the act was the Three Strikes Law. The Three Strikes Law significantly increased prison sentences of persons who had been convicted of a felony, previously convicted of 2 felonies prior, or a violent crime or a serious felony. The limits, this basically meant that after 3 strikes, you would get a life sentence in prison, regardless of what the crimes were. It also increased the severity of mandatory minimum sentences, according to the Brennan Center. It says that anyone convicted of a crime under a mandatory minimum gets at least that sentence. So the goal of these laws is that when they were developed, they would promote uniformity. And it didn't matter how strict or lenient the judge was, the law would just give you the sentence. If you broke the law, you would get a certain sentence automatically. Now, this seems to make sense, like it'd create uniformity, but what it did is it robbed the judges of the ability to make contextual decisions, and instead they had to follow the dictates of this law. These tough-on-crime laws tied the judges' hands, and they were forced to hand out many mandatory life sentences for possession and low-level drug sales. It's important to note also that these crime bills were sponsored by Joe Biden. Now, right now, this is one issue that he has to wrestle with running for president, is that he sponsored these bills that were tough on crime, and they kind of haunt his presidential bid given the current situation. So the reasons that these mandatory minimums are bad, I have 3 that I'm going to say, is that they're too long, first of all. So let's take the story of this man in the middle here. This is Weldon Angelo. He had sold $1,000 of marijuana to a undercover police officer, and the undercover police officer found a firearm in his house at the same time. Now, the mandatory minimum for having a firearm and selling drugs was 55 years in prison. Now, this is a guy who had 2 kids at the time, and you shouldn't sell drugs or do drugs or anything like that, but 55 years is quite a long sentence. You can, blowing up a building or hijacking an airplane results in less than 20 years of prison. This is a man who sold marijuana and happened to have a gun, and he got 55 years in prison until his sentence was actually, commutated by Barack Obama. So he was let out of jail early, and he got to reconnect with his kids. The other thing is that we punish the wrong people. Should this guy really get 55 years in prison? I'll let you maybe think he should. You can debate that. And then lastly, these arresting minor drug offenders with mandatory and providing mandatory minimum sentences doesn't really work to curb drug usage. Since we've created these laws, we have had an increase in drug usage and an increase in the amount of people in prison at the same time. So it kind of shows that it doesn't work. Whoops. Sorry, got to go back. Boom. So this kind of puts everything in context. If we just kind of review where we're at, is that the lyrics in the song are minor drug offenders fill your prisons. You don't even flinch, like Weldon Angelo. All our taxes paying for your wars against the new non-rich. So our taxes are paying to arrest these people and also to put them in prison, which can cost about $30,000 to $60,000 a year, depending on which state you're in. And this is against the new non-rich. This is against the lower echelon of society. And then the lyrics say the percentage of Americans has doubled since 1985, which is true. And this, I think I've given you a good rundown. Since 1985, we've had the amount double, and it's kind of capped out there. But why has it doubled? Because the war on drugs and the crime bill, basically. So far, System of a Down has packed a substantial amount of information in just a few lyrics in this song. But it's not all complaining. It also provides some solutions as well, which we'll get to. One of the lyrics says, all research in successful drug policy shows that treatment should be increased. So treatment for people that are on drugs. And law enforcement decreased. So you shouldn't enforce mandatory minimum sentences or three strikes laws while abolishing mandatory minimum sentences. What they're doing is actually explaining what current policy analysts say is the best way to curb drug abuse in a society. If we take Portugal, for example, Portugal in 2001 decided not to arrest or imprison people who were selling recreational drugs, and they decided to set up organizations that would help addicted or at-risk citizens. Portugal's experiment, now over a decade old, has long been a topic of interest in the public health umbrella of medicine and crime and punishment, and this is all from American Addiction Center. But in 2009, a report issued by Washington, D.C.'s Cato Institute — by the way, Cato Institute is like a libertarian think tank, just so you know the bias there — revealed that 5 years after personal possession of drugs was decriminalized in Portugal, the effects across the country far exceeded expectations. Illegal drug use by teenagers dropped, HIV infections dropped because there was less contaminated needles, and the number of people seeking treatment for substance abuse more than doubled. So these are all positive things that happen in Portugal, and you can look by changing their drug policy to what System of a Down recommends. System of a Down is now our policy providers, right? But this isn't just a problem that affects nationally. This is an Idaho problem. Under current Idaho law, the first-time offense of possession of legal drugs from methamphetamine to heroin or in any amount can bring a sentence of up to 7 years in prison. A second account can double that time. The result is that Idaho actually has the highest incarceration rate of any of the surrounding states and simultaneously has the lowest amount of violent crime. So Idaho is really following this whole issue that we've been discussing. This has become an issue where Idaho's looking at the prospect of spending $500 million on prison expansions. That's your tax money to create 1,500 new 1,500-bed state prison in Idaho. That's according to prisonpolicy.org. Idaho has pretty much a homogenous population, meaning it's mostly white people. But even with that, they still disproportionately arrest African Americans as the country does nationally. Here's a list of, you can see here's violent crime in the blue, and then this is incarceration rate. So the people being incarcerated are not committing violent crimes. Now, if you compare that to Montana, Montana's about equal, right? Washington's also about equal. So that's interesting. Now, the last part here I'm going to break down is System of a Down says why they actually do this. Now, I don't know. It says the bridge of the song says there's secret wars around the world. Utilizing drugs to pay for secret wars around the world. Drugs are now your global policy. Now you police the globe. This really gets into some conspiracy theory of like New World Order stuff. So I'm going to break down what I think that they're talking about. They also say drug money is used to rig elections and train brutal corporate-sponsored dictators around the world. These are some pretty crazy claims. So according to History.com, I think this has to do with the Iran-Contra affair, and I have a breakdown of that from History.com. Now, Pee Wee Herman says don't do crack, but what's left out is that the according to this kind of pseudo-conspiracy is that the government was providing crack to inner-city communities. But you can look that up on your own. I'm just going to break down the Iran-Contra affair under Reagan because I think that's what they're talking about. So basically you had these two groups In Panama, you had the Contras and the Sandinistas. And the Sandinistas were communist, and the Contras were supported by America, okay? Reagan called them the moral equivalent of the Founding Fathers. That's a direct quote. And the CIA trained these Contras and financially supported them. Now, at the same time this was happening, Iran, a country, it's a completely different place, had a hostage situation, and they needed to get the hostages out, and they said that they would trade weapons for hostages, okay? So they passed this bill. $30 million was going to be allocated for weapons and traded to Iran for the hostages, $30 million. Now, the CIA funneled $18 million of those dollars, most of the money, to the Contras in Panama. And just so we know, the Contras were largely funded by the cocaine trade, which made its way to the U.S. Ultimately, the Contras were trying to establish a dictatorship there, which is what System of a Down is talking about. And also, they funneled the cocaine and crack epidemics of the 1980s because they were the ones selling the drugs to America. But that again, it gets a little conspiratorial. This is Oliver North and Reagan, and these are the Contras here, and you can look that up. So another little conspiracy thing of they're trying to build a prison is the prison labor system. So some of you may not know that, but the penal labor system, say in Texas, has a value of $88.9 million. In 6 states in the United States of America, prison labor is free. So prisoners that go to prison work for free. In fact, in Texas, they make JCPenney jeans, or they were for a time. I bet JCPenney is backed out of this. So four states work for free. And then the average wage of prison labor across the country is 63 cents an hour. Okay. Now, of course, you might be like, well, they're in prison. What else are they going to do? And I understand that. 12% of the firefighters fighting California wildfires that are going on right now are actually prisoners. Unfortunately, if they get out of prison, say they become really good at fighting fires and they get out of prison, they can't become a firefighter because they have a past felony conviction, which would disqualify them from doing so. So anyway, you have this prison labor system going on, which could be very akin to slavery, right? You arrest people for a minor drug offense, you throw them into prison, they make JCPenney jeans. That is really going with what Kanye said with that the 13th Amendment is still allowing for slavery as long as there's a crime. And if that crime is a minor drug offense, that's how they all end up in prison. Also goes with the song of, they're trying to build a prison. Perhaps this is the one that they're trying to build. In fact, this all sounds like very much like a, here we go. This is what we're going to talk about. There's another aspect which is called e-carceration, which the issue is that prisons are so full and they cost so much money that they're looking for alternatives. And one of the alternatives is described by Michelle Alexander in The Nation. This is considered... Okay, under e-carceration, the limits on mobility may make it difficult or impossible to get a job, attend school, care for your kids, or visit family members. You're effectively sentenced to an open-air digital prison, one that may not extend beyond your house, your block, or your neighborhood. Basically, what's going on is this idea of putting a little bracelet on your ankle that is a tracking device, and it makes sure that you can only stay within a geographical area. We kind of do this with probation, but this is talking about making it much more systematic, even connecting it to your cell phone. So by using this technology, we would be creating areas in cities that are open-air prisons where the prisoners are monitored by cell phone/ankle bracelets, and drones could be flying around creating video surveillance. I said this was going to get conspiratorial, which is literally the plot. Part of the plot in Escape from New York, the 1981 classic America science fiction action film starring Kurt Russell, which is why this is here. And the Statue of Liberty in the back. New York City becomes a big prison. So if they're actually trying to build a prison, it would be through e-carceration, where you just have these open-air prisons that are, people live in an apartment and stuff, but they just can't leave, and they're being tracked all the time. Okay, so as I said, they do provide solutions. You want to educate people on the justice system and continue to educate yourself. I want to continue to educate myself. Oh, all those popped up at the same time. But amend the 13th Amendment potentially might be a solution. Governors do have the ability to pardon or commute sentences. The presidents usually at the end of their term will pardon or commute a sentence. But governors can as well. And governors can pardon state prisons, and the federal government can pardon federal prison offenses. So And federal prison offenses aren't as much as how many prisoners are in state prisons. You could stop buying goods from companies that utilize slave labor, like JCPenney. And, of course, you can write your representatives educating them on this issue so they vote the way that you want them to in the future. If you want to learn some more about this, there's the new Jim Crow is a book that is about this issue of incarcerating African Americans. Jay-Z has an interesting video about this as well. John Oliver provides a good thing here, a good little video clip kind of explaining it. The 13th is a documentary on Netflix, already explained, and then there's an interview with Weldon Angelo. Any other sources that you have, please feel free to share. I know that for some people watching this, they're like, well, what about this? And you're not talking about this and you're biased, and I'm happy to have that discussion. That's kind of why I'm showing you this. And here's my works cited. Anyway, thank you for watching.